The ground gave a deafening crack as Douglas Crane's patio collapsed, sending a river of mud-shattered stone and twisted garden lights crashing into the yards below. Neighbors screamed, fences buckled, and the hill once held firm by my rain garden slid as if nature had finally lost its patience. And as Douglas stood frozen, rake in hand, watching his backyard sink, all I could think was, they called me alarmist. The engine noise was the first thing that told me something was wrong. A deep mechanical growl followed by the shudder of earth and the crunch of something delicate being torn apart. I parked halfway up Willowcrest Drive, still balancing a leftover slice of carrot cake in one hand, my suitcase in the other, and dropped both when I saw it. A bulldozer, bright yellow brazenly loud, sat parked at an angle on the torn-up edge of my property. What had once been a thriving rain garden now lay scattered in muddy piles across the lawn, crushed wildflowers limp in the dirt like discarded confetti. Uprooted milkweed dangled from the shovel's edge like a final insult. And across the street, three of my neighbors, George from Lot 8, Irene with the stiff hair from the corner house, and that smug couple with the identical rose bushes stood watching. George even waved. I didn't wave back. That garden had taken me 4 months of sweat and planting my knees in the soil, my nails ruined, from digging in clay, each plant hand-selected to hold the slope in place to restore the native ecology of the hillside. But more than that, it was mine. And now it was gone. Let me back up. You're probably wondering how we got here. When I moved to Willow Crest, I wasn't trying to make a statement. I wasn't trying to stand out. I was just tired. After 32 years of designing corporate rooftop gardens and dodging downtown noise, I wanted something simpler, something quieter. I found it, or thought I had, in a modest but elegant home, perched on the side of a wooded slope in Oregon, overlooking a misty valley that turned golden every evening. The backyard faced west, catching the light just so at sunset. And the hill behind the house, it was steep, unpredictable, and naked. No shrubs, no roots, just runoff and regret. The real estate agent had brushed off my concern about erosion with a laugh. Hardly any real storms up here, he said. And besides, we've got a solid HOA. They keep everything in top shape. I should have known then. Within 2 weeks of moving in, I began designing the rain garden. Not just for aesthetics, though, God knows the place needed it, but for function. I'd seen enough landslides in my time to know what happened when steep land went unmanaged. I chose plants that belonged here: deep-rooted grasses, milkweed, bee balm, goldenrod, coneflower. I arranged them in layers, building swales with river rock and native soil, guiding the water down slow and steady when the rains came. I spent every afternoon in that garden mud on my boots, humming to myself, and by late summer it was alive. Bees floated lazily between flowers, butterflies clung to the stalks like ornaments, and even the occasional hummingbird paused by the trellis I'd built. I slept easy at night, knowing that not only was my land safe, but I was giving something back to this hillside. The HOA hadn't said much at first. I got a cheerful welcome letter from Willowcrest Homeowners Association, signed by President Douglas Crane, thanking me for maintaining my property within the spirit of the community. I should have paid more attention to that phrasing. Spirit apparently meant conformity. The first hint of trouble came via a comment from Irene while I was pulling weeds by the mailbox. My husband says wild gardens invite snakes, she said sweetly, her smile tight. I laughed it off, but then the newsletters started arriving. One in particular featured a front-page article titled "Uniform Beauty, the Pride of Willow Crest." It was full of glossy photos, symmetrical hedges, chemically treated lawns, azaleas clipped into perfect spheres. It ended with a reminder to all residents to adhere to the approved landscaping guidelines, including approved plant height, aesthetic cohesion, and my favorite, discouraging ecological distractions. A week later, I got my first formal notice, a plain white envelope tucked under my front doormat. Dear resident, we have received multiple concerns about your front and side landscaping. Please review community standards on page 14, section B. It was unsigned. I didn't panic. I printed out literature from the local extension office about rain gardens, laminated signs identifying pollinator habitat and native species zone, and even added a little QR code on a wooden stake that linked to a website I made myself explaining how the garden worked. I thought naively that once they understood, they'd see it for what it was, an asset. Instead, I got a second notice. then a third, each time more aggressive, violation of community landscaping policy, unauthorized alterations to visible yard space, invasive appearance. I dug out the HOA manual and read it cover to cover. It said nothing about banning rain gardens, but it also never imagined anyone would deviate from the lawn and boxwood template. And now Douglas Crane, retired banker, HOA lifer, and proud owner of the cleanest gutters on the block, had decided I was the problem. I tried to schedule a meeting. I sent emails. I requested a hearing. Silence. I even showed up to the monthly board meeting with photos, soil charts, and a copy of a city-funded pamphlet on green stormwater infrastructure. Douglas looked at me like I'd handed him a dead bird. "We appreciate your enthusiasm," he said, tapping his gavel before I could speak more than 2 sentences. "But we must maintain order. The emergency meeting wasn't announced. I only found out about it later when the invoice arrived. I'd spent the weekend in Portland for my sister's wedding, blissfully unaware that Douglas and his inner circle had voted unanimously to restore my yard to community standard. The bulldozer came Monday morning. My neighbors watched. No one called me. By the time I returned, the garden was a wreck. The soil I had worked with my own hands was now pockmarked with treads. Plants I had nursed from seed were bundled in trash bags by the curb. The laminated signs were snapped in half, one of them, still fluttering from a bent metal stake. And taped to my front door was a folded packet, a notice of landscape remediation, a list of violations, and an invoice for $850 billed to me personally, due in 15 days. I walked the property in a daze, stepping over crushed petals and exposed roots. The slope looked raw, exposed, angry. There was nothing left to hold the earth in place. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the back porch under a thin blanket, listening to the wind whip through the trees and the first drops of fall rain tapping the roof. I thought about what I'd built, about what they'd taken, and about what was coming next. Because the hillside wasn't done, and neither was I. It rained that night. Not a light drizzle or a gentle autumn shower, but a steady, insistent downpour that drummed against the windows like fingers tapping out a warning. I sat on my porch, wrapped in my sister's old quilt, staring at the muddy gash that had once been my rain garden. The water flowed freely now, no roots to hold it, no swales to guide it, just angry little rivers, carving their way downhill, growing stronger with every drop. I watched the first stream punch through the edge of my front yard, slide across the sidewalk, and vanish toward the Jacksons' driveway below. I told myself it was just one storm, but something in my bones knew better. This was just the beginning. By the end of the week, the damage had started showing. First came the crack in the Andersons' walkway, thin like a hairline fracture, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. I was. Then their front lawn began to slump slightly near the mailbox like a tired carpet slowly folding in on itself. The Jacksons' fence, which had once stood straight and proud, now leaned subtly toward the street. None of it was dramatic. Not yet. But I knew the signs. I'd seen it before. Water didn't ask permission. It just moved. I contacted an old colleague from my teaching days at Oregon State, Javier Morales, a sharp-minded soil engineer with a calm demeanor and the kind of quiet confidence you only earn after years of watching land betray its owners. I sent him photos. He called me back within an hour. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said. "Bring coffee." Javier arrived with a worn leather satchel and a yellow notepad already speckled with mud. We walked the property in silence while he prodded the ground with his soil auger, crouched to examine fissures, and ran gloved fingers through the saturated earth. "It's not just you," he said finally. "This whole slope is moving. Slowly, but it's moving." He showed me how the topsoil was sliding over a layer of clay, how the absence of root systems had loosened the hill's grip on itself. "Your garden was anchoring this. Without it, it's like grease on glass." He wrote up a report full of charts, projections, and one particularly nasty map that showed the predicted path of future slides. He handed it to me with a look that said, "They need to see this, but they won't want to." I printed copies, attached photos, and drafted a formal letter of concern. I highlighted the section warning of potential damage to homes downhill, especially those with older retaining structures like Douglas Crane's. I walked the packet up to the HOA office and dropped it in the mail slot. Then, for good measure, I emailed every board member individually and posted the warning in the Willowcrest online forum under the heading Urgent Slope Instability Warning. Engineering report attached. 3 days passed. Nothing. Then came the monthly HOA meeting. The room smelled like burnt coffee and forced civility. Douglas sat at the center of the table, gavel within reach, wearing his signature tan sweater vest and that smirk he used when someone challenged his control. I sat quietly in the third row, holding Javier's report in my lap. When they reached community concerns, I stood to speak. "Mr. Crane," I said, keeping my voice even, "have you reviewed the engineering report regarding slope erosion and potential hazards to nearby homes?" He barely glanced at me. "We've reviewed the material," he said. "The board believes the findings are speculative and unnecessarily alarmist. We've had wet seasons before." He tapped his notes and added, "This appears to be another case of someone trying to create drama to justify previous noncompliance." There were chuckles from the back. Irene crossed her arms and muttered something about Chicken Little. I opened my mouth to respond, but Douglas banged the gavel. "Moving on," he said. "We've heard enough about the weather." I left before the meeting ended. That weekend the storm hit. Not just rain, a deluge. Wind lashed through the trees like it was angry, and the skies poured water for 12 straight hours. By midnight, Willow Crest looked like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. At 2 a.m., I was still awake, pacing the floor when I heard the sound. A deep, grinding crack like the earth yawning open. Then a crash. A second later, my phone buzzed with a message from the Jacksons. "You need to come outside. Now." I threw on boots and grabbed my flashlight. The wind slapped my face as I stepped into the chaos. Mud slid in thick sheets down the hill behind Douglas's house. His brand new stone patio had collapsed, a jagged trench opening up where flagstones had once gleamed. Lawn furniture lay half buried. A twisted metal trellis poked from the dirt like a skeletal hand. Part of his decorative garden wall had washed down into the Mitchell's backyard, smashing a ceramic bird bath in its path. Water surged through what used to be a perfectly trimmed hedgerow. Douglas stood on his back porch in slippers drenched pale as chalk. He held a garden rake in one hand, like it might hold back the tide. Neighbors gathered despite the storm. No one spoke. We all watched as the hill gave up another small section to the dark. It was a slow-motion disaster. Nothing explosive, just relentless. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. By morning, the news had spread. Damage reports began trickling in cracked foundations, warped doors, tilted porches. The HOA sent out a mass email, carefully avoiding terms like erosion or landslide. Instead, it referred to seasonal drainage impacts. It also reminded residents to check their gutters and report any unauthorized modifications to their landscaping. I stared at the screen, hands shaking. Then the insurance calls began. First the Mitchells, then the Andersons, then 3 more families I barely knew. They all received the same response claim: denied. Why? Because the erosion was not classified as a natural disaster. It was the result of intentional landscape modification, specifically the removal of a previously functioning erosion control feature. My rain garden, I couldn't believe it. The HOA hadn't just destroyed my work. They'd destroyed their own liability protection. And now the neighbors were learning that the board's decision had cost them tens of thousands with no insurance safety net. Rumors ignited like dry leaves. Whispers of backroom deals, favoritism, kickbacks. Someone mentioned that the landscaping company that did the bulldozing had never done work in the community before. Another said the owner drove a truck with no business markings. People began asking questions: who authorized the job? Why wasn't it bid out properly? Who signed the check? Tension in the neighborhood thickened. I got nods now. Even Irene looked away when we crossed paths at the mailbox. Douglas, for his part, disappeared. No porch sit-downs, no newsletters signed with his name, no more impromptu HOA visits to check paint colors. He was hiding, waiting, but I wasn't. I spent the next 2 weeks photographing every crack, every sagging fence, every inch of runoff damage. I updated Javier weekly, collecting rainfall data and slope progression. I compiled timelines, printed emails, saved forum posts. I filed a formal complaint to the city's Environmental Commission. And most importantly, I made an appointment with an attorney. Because this wasn't over, not even close. This was the cost of arrogance, of control over reason. They had ripped out my garden thinking they were erasing a problem. But they hadn't realized they'd torn out the one thing keeping this community together. And now it was unraveling, inch by inch, house by house. They wanted uniformity. What they were about to get was accountability. I didn't knock on Tina McAdams' office door so much as I pushed it open with the kind of quiet fury that no longer needed explanation. She'd already heard from Javier. By the time I sat down, hands folded tightly in my lap, she'd poured me a cup of dark roast and handed over a manila folder thicker than a Sunday paper. "Let's begin," she said, eyes sharp behind slim glasses. I'd heard she was the kind of attorney who treated HOA board meetings like combat zones and made board presidents cry in mediation rooms. That sounded just right. I gave her everything. The photos, the letters, the timestamps on the bulldozer, Javier's erosion report, my copy of the HOA's bylaws, the HOA emails that were still public, even screenshots from the community forum where Douglas had called my concerns hysterical exaggeration. Tina listened quietly, taking notes with a fountain pen that glided like a scalpel. When I was done, she leaned back and exhaled slowly. "They buried you under that hill," she said. "Time to return the favor. Within 2 weeks, we filed suit. The official charges were long property destruction, negligence breach of fiduciary duty failure to follow HOA due process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But it was the discovery process where things truly started to shake loose. Tina subpoenaed internal HOA documents, and that's when we found the email thread. Dated 2 months before my garden was bulldozed, it was a back and forth between Douglas Crane and board members Linda Ackers and Mark Bennett. They had received not one, but 2 separate warnings from local landscape professionals hired by the HOA to review erosion risks in the community. Both reports explicitly advised against removing native vegetation on the slope behind my house and suggested that any changes to existing erosion controls should only proceed with a full soil assessment. One reply from Douglas read, "Not worried. We'll just slap some sod over it later if need be. That weed patch is an eyesore and a liability." And then in a separate thread, we hit gold. The landscaping company that had bulldozed my rain garden Emerald Terrain LLC was barely 3 months old when they got the contract. Registered under a different first name, but the same last name as Douglas's nephew, Ryan Crane. No other bids had been solicited. No board vote was officially recorded. The payment, just under $19,000, had been rushed through in a single transaction, signed off by Douglas and Mark, bypassing the HOA treasurer entirely. It was a closed loop of bad faith and self-dealing, and now it was unraveling in court. Word spread like wildfire, first through whispers, then in bold headlines. The Willowcrest Gazette ran a front-page article, "HOA Wrecks Eco Garden Triggers Landslide Chaos." The local CBS affiliate interviewed Javier on a rain-slick slope, while he pointed at fault lines and spoke in calm, unassailable science. Douglas refused to comment, but the pressure mounted. Homeowners once passive and proud of their tidy lawns were now furious. They weren't just angry about the slope or the lawsuits. They were livid about their own wallets, because HOA insurance refused to cover the damage. The insurance carrier had reviewed the engineering report and internal emails and ruled that the damage resulted from a deliberate, unauthorized alteration of natural infrastructure. Translation, not an accident, not covered. Now homeowners were facing repair costs ranging from $15,000 to $60,000, cracked foundations, sinking patios, collapsing fences, and with the HOA's reserve funds depleted by the retainer fees for their overpriced law firm, the only way forward was a special assessment fee. The letter went out a week before trial. Cold, clinical, unapologetic. To meet ongoing legal obligations and projected liabilities, a one-time assessment of $1, $200 per household will be due within 60 days. The outrage was volcanic. Emergency HOA meetings turned into shouting matches. Douglas skipped the first. At the second, he tried to present a slideshow, claiming the damage was the result of natural aging infrastructure, but the crowd drowned him out. "You lied to us," someone yelled. "You destroyed her garden, and now our property value too," screamed another. By the time Tina and I entered the courtroom that Monday morning, the HOA board looked like it had been through a war. Mark had resigned 2 days before the trial. Linda followed the morning of. That left Douglas sitting alone at the defense table, flanked by 2 stone-faced attorneys and 0 supporters in the gallery. The judge, Hanosh. Deborah Kinley was a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s, with a reputation for despising wasted court time and crooked HOA cases. Tina presented our case like a tightrope walker, graceful, balanced, and never missing a beat. She showed the gardens before and after photos, the invoices, the engineering reports, the bulldozer's time-stamped entry, the whistleblower documents from the treasurer showing improper board procedure, the emails, especially the one where Douglas wrote, "We'll fix any issues later if we have to." When Tina read that line aloud, the gallery murmured like a wave moving through dry grass. Douglas's lawyer tried to spin the narrative that the board was trying to maintain safety and cohesion in the neighborhood, that the garden was a violation of visual standards, that the collapse was unforeseeable. But then the judge asked one question. Were you or were you not advised by two licensed professionals that removing the vegetation would destabilize the slope? The pause said it all. Yes, the lawyer admitted. Then this court finds the damages foreseeable, she said, and brought the gavel down like thunder. The judgment totaled $1.2 million, full compensation for the destroyed garden, additional damages for the increased risk to my property, legal fees, and a civil penalty for bad faith litigation and gross negligence. Douglas didn't wait for the bailiff. He stood up and walked out before the judgment was even fully read. He moved out 2 weeks later, selling his house at a massive loss to a flipper who didn't yet understand that cracked retaining walls don't heal with paint. I used part of the settlement to rebuild, not just my rain garden, but a stronger one. A two-tiered slope retention system designed by Javier's firm with deep-rooted natives, absorbent terraces, and a lower-level basin that could hold thousands of gallons of stormwater. It took 3 months. During that time, I got visits from neighbors I barely knew. Some apologized, some just watched wide-eyed as the hillside was transformed. On the last day, I stood beside the crew as they set the carved stone marker into the soil at the top terrace. It read, "This garden holds the hill." Designed by Marissa Langley 2025, deeply etched, unmissable, facing the street. Leah Monroe, a 34-year-old environmental consultant, took over as HOA president later that spring. She visited me with a clipboard, asked honest questions, and stayed long enough to help plant 2 butterfly bushes near the lower terrace. Under her leadership, the board voted to revise the landscaping guidelines. They now encourage native plantings, recommended rain gardens on sloped lots, and launched a grant program for erosion control landscaping funded in part by the settlement money. Workshops were hosted. Neighbors who once obsessed over matching mailbox posts were now comparing milkweed cultivars and asking Javier how to build better swales. The slope still bore scars, but so did the people. Trust would take time, but the fear had lifted. The silence on Willowcrest Drive was no longer heavy, just peaceful. Months later, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and watched as a crew down the block installed a small, tiered garden behind the Andersons' house. Their youngest daughter, Katie, pointed excitedly at a red columbine that looked just like the ones from my first garden, the one they bulldozed. I smiled and closed my eyes. They had tried to erase my work with a machine, but what they didn't understand, what they never saw coming, was that gardens grow back, stronger, deeper, rooted not just in soil but in truth. And truth once planted has a way of blooming. The story of Marissa Langley is more than just a fight between a homeowner and an HOA. It's a powerful reminder of what happens when truth, persistence, and environmental wisdom are pitted against arrogance and conformity. At its core, this story teaches us that doing what is right often comes with resistance, but staying silent in the face of injustice only allows that resistance to grow stronger. Marissa didn't build her rain garden to defy anyone. She built it to stabilize her land, restore native beauty, and protect her neighbors. Her intentions were thoughtful, her methods backed by science, and her approach deeply rooted in respect for nature. Yet she was met with ridicule, fines, and destruction, not because she broke the rules, but because she didn't fit the mold of what some considered acceptable. And that's the lesson: conformity is not always wisdom. Too often, rules are enforced not to protect but to control, driven by outdated preferences, appearances, or personal ego. When people in power ignore facts, dismiss professional advice, or silence concerned voices, the consequences go far beyond bruised egos. In this case, it led to real financial harm, structural damage, and community division. But there's also a deeper encouragement here: stand firm. When you're grounded in truth, knowledge, and good intention, don't be intimidated by those who try to bury you figuratively or literally. Marissa didn't retaliate with rage. She responded with action, evidence, and integrity. She used her voice, her knowledge, and the legal system to restore justice, not just for herself, but for an entire neighborhood that had been misled. To all our listeners and viewers, whether you're facing HOA trouble, community injustice, or any form of quiet discrimination, you have the right to speak up and the power to make change. Protect your home, protect the truth, and never underestimate the strength of standing your ground, even if it means standing alone at first. From the team at US Justice Story, we want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for taking the time to listen, reflect, and support stories that matter. If this story moved you, taught you something, or reminded you of your own experience, please consider sharing it. Your voice helps others find theirs. Until next time, stay rooted in truth and never stop fighting for what's right.